The first question comes quite naturally right now. There is a lot of music in the book, obviously. How do you expect the reader who doesn't have some musicians handy, how do you expect the reader to deal with music in a narrative? Do you actually want the reader to play the pieces in his or her head while he's reading? Do you expect the reader to maybe get a recording and listen to it? Or do you think the prose writer can recreate the atmosphere of music so that the reader doesn't really have to hear the music mentally or in reality while he's reading?
It's a very good question, but before I answer it, first of all, an apology that I cannot speak the language of Goethe, or for that matter, Müller and Heine. My profound apologies. But the only way we could make a conversation flow between us, as we found in the past, is to just do it in one language. But my profound apologies. Ich kann nicht Deutsch.
We tried with a translator once, and it was a very good translator, but she still brought it all to a standstill. So
she was a very good translator. Yes. It's a very good question, Daniel, because I think you always take a risk. You cannot rely on your reader having the same connection to the same kind of music as you do. It always amazes me that there are millions, hundreds of millions of people living in Western Europe who are not remotely interested in its classical tradition, who could live their whole lives with pop music or with jazz or with folk music and have no reference emotionally to the masterworks of Schubert or Bach or whatever. And yet their lives are rich and inner and marvelous. So I make no condescension about that. And that's why, rather than simply evoke an emotion by referring to some music, I try to actually describe say with the Mahler, making those first two notes, then a third, and then the expansive spread, which would carry its own emotion. And sometimes I've used music, say, on Chesil Beach, the mutual incomprehension between two lovers. He loves rock and roll and blues and rhythm and blues. She loves only classical music. And their mutual incomprehension of the music. She cannot understand, for example, why in any kind of rock and roll, when the music is so simply in a 4/4 time, why you would need a drummer. And she asks herself, you don't have a drummer in a string quartet where the rhythms are even more complicated. So what's with this drummer, this terrible banging that goes on? And he finds her kind of music full of a prim agitation, as he says. And they each try very hard because they love each other, and they fail because their love is doomed. So I think you have to use the music for something else.
And did you? I always went to ask that the Yeats piece. Did you? Of course, it's great music, but is it safe to say you chose that one for the lyrics? Because in a way, this line, she bid me first take love easy and then take life easy, I think it becomes kind of the central, not metaphor, the central line of the whole, of the movement of the book in a way. That's what liberal, reasonable, secularism is, taking life easy. Is that? Did you choose that for the lyrics, or am I making too much of it here?
You call them lyrics. It's a poem by Yeats.
I know.
And he wrote the book. Yeah. It's a rather marvelous poem, a strange poem, because it dates from Yeats's early period. It's written in a meter we associate more with French poetry, with Alexandrines, with 6 feet, 12-syllable lines. And it is very, very cunning, these little shifts between the first and second. Why did I choose it? I have an emotional connection to it because the young boy, the Jehovah's Witness boy who's refusing a blood transfusion, once he plays it on the violin, the judge sings it with him, he then discovers Yeats. And Yeats was the first poet in my life at the age of 16 or 17. And I gave some of my own emotional excitement at coming into poetry and the tradition of the novel and getting crazy about literature at that sort of crucial age, 16, 17. I gave him a lot of my enthusiasm, and I gave him my Yeats. And that poem really was one of the first that I knew. And then many years later, my wife, Annalena, and I took my mother, who was just 6 months away from the long decline into dementia. So it was her last period of really being sane. We went to stay in Dublin, and we stayed in the famous Sherborne Hotel. And there was a harpist playing. And I think I've got it right. That we were sitting at the table with my mother, having a very nice time, and we had quite a lot of wine, and beginning to feel very warm towards the world. And I said to Annalena, I bet I can make you cry. And I went over to the harpist and said, could you play She Moves Through the Fair, which is a beautiful song. And she did shed a tear. But then, full of determination, she got up and said, I bet I make you cry. And she went to the harpist and got her to play Down by the Sally Gardens. And indeed, I disgraced myself. So I have a long history with this. And it has a very strong connection to the opening of the gates to all of learning, all of music, all of poetry that this young boy, who's had a very strict and narrow upbringing within the Jehovah's Witness, it's part of that sort of liberation.
Although Yeats himself might have sympathized with the not taking a blood transfusion. He had very weird ideas.
Oh, I don't know. Yeats wanted to live forever. And some of his most magnificent and furious poetry towards the end was raging against the fact that he was no longer the man he was sexually. He underwent all kinds of terrible surgical operations, having a monkey's glands put into his, which, of course, tissue rejection, I think, got its name from Yeats, really.
And yeah, there is also the other great writer whom I had to think of when I read this book. So that there's something about the atmosphere, especially the beautiful dark sadness of the ending, which made me think of James Joyce's The Dead. And then I read in an interview that Joyce was indeed an inspiration for the book. And I'm still a bit puzzled about it because I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Why does it feel so Joycean? What exactly was the inspiration? I felt it, but I didn't quite understand what it was. And
for those who don't know it, The Dead is a novella, really, by James Joyce. It's rather overlooked because it's right at the end of a volume of short stories, a famous volume of short stories called Dubliners. If it was published alone, if it stood alone, I think people would recognize it for what it is. What I think it is, at least, is one of the most perfect fictions in English. It's haunted me for years. It shapes the end of my novel, Saturday. A couple go to a party. They come. This is in Dublin, turn of the century. They come away and rather drunk. He, a journalist, and she, his wife, for many, many years, tells him of a boy that she once loved. For a moment, jealousy boils up in his blood, but the story is set way, way in the past. It's such a beautiful story of mutual misunderstanding. And since misunderstanding across a gulf of religious faith on the one hand and a kind of skeptical materialism that the judge has on the other, it seemed to me appropriate that I could finally lay to rest this ghost of never being able to really fully engage with this story unless I got past it. So I wanted to pay full tribute to it. So it's only the last 3 pages of the novel try to evoke that moment in a hotel room, which might well have been the Sherborne, the hotel where Annalena and I were staying, of the saddest of stories, finishing in a rather mystical way in the Joyce story when he sees the snowflakes falling and thinks of them as the souls of all the dead, whereas mine has a somewhat other, takes a slightly different direction. But it's sometimes I think in literature, literature can be very much like science. I mean, Newton famously said that he stood on the shoulders of giants. Well, I think novelists and poets also stand on the shoulders of giants. We didn't invent the form of the novel. We didn't invent its methods of characterization. We have behind us a lifetime of reading and love for the forms. And every now and then that has to be part of your reality. It has to sweep in and take your heart.
And of course, the topical connection is that the last moment of both books is a woman feeling guilty about the death of a young man, which she might not have been guilty of, but she feels guilty anyway. So it's a complicated moment of guilt.
Yeah. Guilt is guilt, and even if it's irrational or even if it's ambiguous, you don't escape it. In the Joyce story, she tells of the young boy, 17 years old, who is ill, and who's in love with her, and he comes and stands under her window, and it's raining and cold. And she goes down into the garden and urges him to go home. She sends him home, and then a week later she hears that he's died. And she feels that for love of her. In fact, she says, this was going to be my epigraph for the novel, I think he died for love of me. So this is where the two novels meet. You know.
But of course, your novel asks, or makes the reader ask the question, and I feel kind of reluctant to ask you about that because it's so beautifully ambivalent. But as we are here to talk about it, I cannot not ask you, how guilty do you think is Fiona of the young man dying? Formally she didn't do anything wrong. He asks her to be, we don't have to do the spoiler alert thing. I mean, we're here to talk about the book, so yeah.
You will have forgotten this conversation.
You will. So the young boy wants her to become kind of, maybe he's in love with her, but it's more of a surrogate mother and teacher thing he wants from her, and she refuses, which is, of course, formally correct. A judge can't do that. But still, of course, at the ending suggests that she feels guilty and that maybe she did something wrong. So what do you think about that?
Professionally, she does nothing wrong. It's just one more case that's come before her, and we establish in the novel that she's dealing with maybe 5 or 6 cases in a day, and she can't continue any kind of relationship outside the court. On the other hand, as the epigraph, which is a quotation from a piece of legislation called the Children Act, passed in 1989 with various amendments ever since, it's the court's paramount consideration, the welfare, in other words, the well-being of the child. And she has confined that sense of well-being just to the courtroom. And although she has behaved impeccably in some ways, she has also protected herself against a huge wave of emotional release that would come towards her if she got involved in this boy, because he is the child she feels that she never had. She's a childless woman who regrets her childlessness. She's just been too busy all her life to settle down, to have children. She married the law. And yet, strangely, she married family law when she has no family. And for her part, she represents an escape. She wants her as a guru. And yes, there's even a touch of the erotic in there too. Not all guilt, as I said, is rational. And not everything that Fiona does is at all rational, even though she stands in her arguments for reasonableness against profound and blind religious faith.
But there seems to be a more general point in this, that it's not enough to tell people that there is no God. You need to teach them afterwards how to live in a world without God, and how that it's actually a good thing, that it's a way to take life easy.
Yeah, that's well put. By going to his bedside, she has brought into his life the beginnings of poetry. Suddenly, no one has ever spoken to him in quite the way she has. He begins to doubt, and then he loses his faith. But she puts nothing in its place. Mm-hmm. So the letters that he writes to her, the heartfelt letters, the long poem in the style of Yeats that he writes to her, go unanswered. So she has given a sensible, rational decision, but she hasn't given him anything else to replace what was all his life. You know, he was a boy who was loved, and he lived within a tight religious community. Suddenly he's cast out into the world of doubt, and then beyond doubt of lack of belief. And she hasn't given him the rope, the steady ground on which he could stand. And for those reasons, she blames herself. But we don't know, and I leave it open for the reader. He may have regained his faith when he goes back into hospital and refuses the blood transfusion again and dies. I've left it entirely open.
But there's a very, for me, surprising moment when she thinks about the fact that letting the boy just die because he wants to die, it wouldn't be an irrational decision at all. So when she realizes that her idea that she has a duty to protect the boy, that duty is also a value decision. It's not purely rational. There is something irrational to saving the boy too. So either way, it's kind of a decision of values.
I think it's entirely rational to save someone underage, under 18, from becoming a martyr to their parents' faith.
But doesn't Fiona at some point have this thought that it wouldn't be irrational to just let him die and it would be much easier?
Oh, that's a moment of nihilism that sweeps over her, yeah. But then she returns to court and does what the law demands, and in fact what courts all around the world do, when a Jehovah's Witness refuses a blood transfusion and their life depends on it, and they're under 18, then the court takes the decision, well, you can make that decision when you are old enough, but for now, the court makes you their child and prevents you and allows the treatment. The tragic thing is that, we believe things, I should think many people, nearly everyone in this room, believe things when they were 19, which they might not still believe. But the law is all about drawing lines, and there might be 30-year-olds you'd want to save from themselves, and 65-year-olds for that matter. But as I say, there have to be these lines drawn, and when he goes back into hospital, it's a fundamental human right in our medical tradition that you may not treat someone against their will. And I think that's actually a very good and sound philosophy, but it has on the edges the cases that are complete tragedies, wastes of lives.
So I just read the much spoken about new Michel Houellebecq book, Submission, and it was interesting to read it right before doing a conversation about the Children Act, because it seemed to me the two books are, they have in a lot of ways quite the opposite approach to a similar topic. Houellebecq's overall idea is that liberal secular democracy has so little to offer that people get so sad and so depressed, and we have such sad lives in our Western liberal world that there's just no good argument to fight off religious dictatorship. And your book is all about what liberal secularism does have to offer. So is it true? Could we say that your book? I'm not going to ask you about Welbeck. I know you haven't read it yet, but is it? Would you agree with that? That your book is about how much atheism and rationality have to offer, including music, of course, music and science?
Well, I think even those of us who might say that they don't really hold a scientific worldview carry around in their minds a view that is shaped by the free inquiry of science. Like most of us are now convinced that the Earth goes around the sun, that our galaxy is of a colossal size, but is over only one of 200 billion, that the way we describe the very, very small and the extremely large both run counter to our common sense view of the world, and many other assumptions about life on Earth and the fact that it evolved. Even those of us who are not scientists have absorbed, I think, a fabulous worldview. And there is much wrong with liberal democracies, but one of the good things about it is that it constantly tells itself there is much wrong with liberal democracies. And it is probably the least bad way we have discovered to organize ourselves. I mean, Winston Churchill famously said democracy is the least bad political system, and I think that's well put. I think we were talking of dentistry this afternoon, and can I reveal that you might one day write a novel about a dentist?
You can reveal that.
Well, it's too late. I've revealed it. Think of the privileges of modernity that we take entirely for granted. Anesthetic. Oh, read of Samuel Pepys having a stone removed from his bladder. The best surgeon in London was the one who could cut through his perineum, cut a slice into his bladder, remove the stone, come out, sew it all back together in 45 seconds, while 4 strong men held him down. I'm glad to live in an age that is privileged by the work of many, many scientists who were opposed, by the way, by the medical profession, who thought that pain was an essential element of being ill. So I don't think religion could have delivered us anesthetic. In fact, unless you'd want to say that religion is an anesthetic. But that's another matter. So the fact that we can, and I've written about this recently, a city, Berlin, London, Paris, any world city you care to name, is the size of a medium-sized American cattle ranch in which maybe somewhere between 4 and 10 million people might live. And they have colossally different worldviews. Christians blaspheme daily in the face of Islam, and vice versa. And there are people for whom religious belief doesn't even intrude in their lives. It's not even an issue. They're all within a stone's throw of each other. Who will guarantee the peace? And my firm view is not religion, only a secular democracy. Only a secular democracy will tolerate all religions, either because it believes in them all or believes in none. And I think that Welbeck, who is younger than me, and therefore has, I think, the delicious pessimism of a younger man. Whereas when you get into your mid-60s, you do try and accumulate around all that we've managed to do well, even though horrified by what we're currently doing badly. And I can't pass a supermarket in February and see a pile of oranges and think, thank God for this. This is amazing. This is amazing. No medieval king could have an orange in February, or even an orange for that matter.
Yeah, I also have to say, every time, really, more or less every time I take a shower, I have a second where I think of your passage in Saturday about the incredible luxury of being able to shower in your home in fresh, clean water. And so there are very few writers who can make one feel as happy with modernity.
My fantasy in Saturday was that he could imagine his great-great-great-grandchildren huddling round a peat fire and some old man saying, yes, in February it was possible in the old days, without even being very rich, to stand naked under a hot stream of water and rub amber-coloured liquids into your hair to make it clean. And I've always had this fantasy of when the Romans left Britain, I see myself waving them goodbye on the cliffs of Dover. And I think, I will not get a hot shower for 1,600 years.
Anyway, the most striking passage, I won't go on talking about Houellebecq, just one more thing. For me, the most striking passage in his novel is when he manages to really make the case for Islam. And he's not a Muslim, as we know. And it's beautifully written. It's the best passage in the book, and it's a really convincing tour de force. And you can feel that the writer has kind of a certain sportive ambition to show you, I can do this, and I can do it better than they. I can do it better than those Muslim thinkers. And I had to, John Updike did something similar with Terrorist.
In Terrorist, yeah.
He really makes the case for radical Islam in a way that's very convincing to the reader, and you can feel a certain writerly pride in I can do this.
But does Houellebecq make the case for Islam or for violent jihadist Islam?
No. It's not. It's just for a modest Islamic dictatorship. Which is bad enough, but.
Just a modest dictatorship. Yeah.
But
you've tried that in Germany, and.
But the thing that I kept thinking while I was reading The Children Act, is he going to do something like that for Jehovah's Witnesses and the idea of not taking blood transfusions? Will Ian, with all his brilliance, make me for 1 or 2 pages believe that there is something amazing in having this kind of firm conviction and not taking blood transfusion? And you don't. I mean, you don't take it serious.
I do. The father of the boy makes a very, very strong case, I think, in court. You turn the pages too quickly.
I just felt like you weren't convinced.
I gave him some of the best lines, like Milton did for Satan. But coming back to Houellebecq, that's enough about me. That's why we value the novel. I mean, that's the right way to do it, to get inside this. If you want to understand a murder, you have to get inside the mind of the murderer. And if you want to understand why 1.2 billion people are firm believers in a thought system, then you must get inside it in a way that no monograph, no non-fiction could really deliver to you. So that sounds to me a superb stroke. And as you say, Updike in his very last novel, Terrorist, takes us through the whole education of a young man, not only turning to Islam, but then to violent jihadism. But even then, each step along the way seems perfectly argued, beautifully done, sensually done too. And in fact, it sounds like both writers have a lot in common in touching on this sort of near ecstasy of sensual belief. It's not intellectual belief so much as a kind of sensual sense of suddenly the world becomes right and you can act within it decisively.
Which makes me ask about Updike, because you're so critical of religious belief and you admire John Updike so much. And what did you make of his belief? Did you find it a strange thing you were ignoring while you're reading him, or is there something you you like.
Oh no, I think that's the engine of Updike's brilliance. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, here was a man who could, in the novel Roger's version, get his mind round computer science long before anybody else was really thinking about it in the mid-1980s, who's written, could really take his thoughts anywhere, but was a passionate Protestant believer who said he could not make the leap of unfaith. And it's that tension when his characters, like one of his characters in Couples, leaves his cheats on his wife and goes and has sex with the neighbor. She's lying on the grass and the neighbor is making love to her, and she senses that she's right under the eye of God, and she rather wishes they'd made love under a bush. She can't quite banish this notion. So I think that tension between what he held to be intellectually true but could never quite take that leap of unfaith is what makes him so interesting a writer.
But is there something in religion that, as a writer, as a prose writer, you can find interesting or admirable in the way that Updike's characters, there's a certain importance to their decision, a certain weight to what they're doing because they act in the eyes of God. Do you sometimes envy prose writers who have that, or is it just you just don't?
I think that the first thing to say about the major Abrahamic religions is that they are colossal accumulations and repositories of human fear and human hope. And fear and hope have to be of profound interest to anyone, not just to novelists. So the fear of death and the hope of the afterlife, or the hope for forgiveness, or the fear of eternal punishment, which is, again, a sort of an elaboration on the notion of guilt. They have to be of supreme importance. Whether you believe or not, and just leave aside all the beautiful cathedrals and the cantatas of Bach and all the other things that have accumulated around religion, those central things, hope and fear, seem to me why we have to go on taking it seriously. Whether you believe it or not, it's there. And there's been a poll. We always cite with some sort of superiority those polls about what Americans believe, but there's been a poll recently of what British people believe, and just over 50% have a firm conviction of an afterlife. And that was a poll carried out just last month. Well, we live in strange times. So,
But another book of yours I kept thinking about when I read the Children's Act was Black Dogs. Yeah. Because in Black Dogs you have this ongoing dialogue between the two conflicting positions, between relaxed liberal secularism and the other position. It's not quite, it's partly religion, it's partly some kind of vague, esoteric spiritualism. And in Black Dogs, you really managed to make them both, and to stay in the same distance from both of them. That's how it feels. So, how does this book relate to Black Dogs? Could we say that you move towards towards one of the sides, or towards one of the characters? It's also these in-laws of the narrator who are on both sides of that argument. So could I say that you move towards the father-in-law and away from the mother-in-law in terms of Black Dogs?
The father figure in Black Dogs is a sort of political activist who spends his whole life trying to improve the world, but at the same time neglects his family, as is often the case with politicians. In this new novel, The Children Act, I want to suggest that however deficient you think a worldview that wishes to let a child die because of a couple of lines in Leviticus and Genesis, on the other hand, Fiona, the judge, the rationalist, very easily, quickly discovers the limits of her own rationality. From trivial matters like when her husband goes off to have an affair, the very first thing she does, and which she's advised clients all through her legal lifetime, she goes and changes the locks. One of the most stupid things you can do, put yourself immediately on the wrong side of the law. She gives the boy, who tracks her down across the length of England, a full kiss on the lips, raising his hopes even as she has no intention of helping him or following through. So I think I remain more or less, I mean, I have my own beliefs, but what I actually want to play out in the novel is that none of us can live with the full answers to things, and we are all likely to make mistakes that are right in the path of what we say we believe.
Speaking of which, there's one character nobody ever asks or talks about, as far as I could see, also in the reviews, which is Fiona's husband. At least I didn't see anything about him. And well, whenever he gets mentioned, everyone just seems to agree that he behaves terribly and that he's a selfish idiot. But he also tries to do the right thing in a way. So, I mean, well, he tries to be open and honest in a strange way, but
he tries to be very rational.
Yes.
And look where it gets you. Yes, honesty is better than dishonesty.
Maybe not. That makes you, the way he behaves make you doubt that. But
well, that's right. You could always take that view. Well, he's a very minor character. I mean, I'm writing the screenplay at the moment, and my first job is to try and write his part up, because actually in the novel it's tiny. He's just instrumental in precipitating a crisis.
So, another thing I always, I know we're approaching the end here, but one thing I always wanted to ask you is, there are these two big principles, I would say, in your writing, which is which is modernism, so the perfection of style, the way you've been shaped by modernism, and on the other hand, you are really not afraid to use plot and to tell stories with also sometimes very radical plot twists. And you once said that it was important for you to get away from the heavy hand of modernism, and I keep thinking of that. But were you sometimes tempted to write a novel like Virginia Woolf, just some kind of plotless prose poem novel-like thing, or what was plot always so important to you that you never even got close to doing that?
I did mess around with that kind of thing in my early 20s, but it never really satisfied me. I think that I come back to this famous line of Henry James in an essay he wrote called The Art of Fiction, which actually I was looking at it again the other day. I see it's a book review, and yet it's now so full of wisdom about fiction that people forget that it was a review of a book by a man called Walter Besant. Anyway, he pronounces in this essay, in this monograph, that the first duty of the novelist is to be interesting. Now, that really begs... that does beg a lot of questions as to what's interesting. And I know that some readers of Henry James's late novels, like The Ambassadors and The Golden Bowl, might think they're not very interesting and he's failed in his duty. I think they are interesting, by the way. But I think modernism when it was in its pomp, did begin to loathe the reader. There was a kind of elitism that was central to it, which is why I think so many of the high modernists were writers who were very attracted to right-wing philosophies. Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher and critic, had complete disdain for the general run of readers. Only 200 or 300 people could understand certain poems or certain novels. And that seemed to run against all the wonderful, full-blooded creations of the 19th century, of Tolstoy, of George Eliot, of Dickens. And I thought as we move through the 21st century, we come back to Newton and standing on the shoulders of giants. We should take whatever we can from modernism, but not drop in the process. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Take also the beautiful conventions of establishing character that were developed so wonderfully in the 19th century. And also the machinations of plot, which were well laid down in drama long before. So we can have it all. There's no reason why you can't have novels that reflect on their own processes, that are written with the care with which Joyce or Proust wrote theirs. Not necessarily with the same success, but and yet still have those marvelous things that provoke curiosity and allow us to be interested. Because unless you're interested, it's very hard to read a novel. You can get through a boring poem if it's 3 minutes long, but to spend 16 hours with a novel that you don't find interesting just because you think it's good for you is a kind of mental poison, I think.
So my last question, you have somehow, maybe more by accident than by planning it, you have established this beautiful rhythm of writing historical novel, then a contemporary one, then a historical one, then a contemporary one. There might be a few outliers, but in general, that has been your rhythm over the last few years.
Yeah.
So, can we deduce from that your next book might be a historical novel again?
It's a historical novel set in the present. I'm like a Jehovah's Witness. I'm very superstitious about talking about a novel that I've hardly started, if I have even started one. So that's a pint of blood I refuse. But also, I just want to say, because it's almost time to say goodbye, what a colossal honor it is to think that you've been sitting here all day thinking about me. Michael Frayn, who I don't know if you know Michael Frayn's work, but he's a Germanophile. In fact, he goes to German lessons twice a week. He happened to ask me. He said, "In which country outside the Anglophone world do you have the most readers?" And I was able to say without hesitation, "It's Germany. I have the strongest connection here of anywhere." But to think that you've been here all day fills me with guilt and pride. And so thank you very, very much. It's a great honor. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you.